Well, good morning. It's great to see you all here Friday morning before a 3-day weekend. At least in some places, Memorial Day is a 3-day weekend. I guess not everywhere it is. But it's nice to see all y'all here this morning. So as you know, since you signed up for this event, we're going to be talking about parental alienation and several different angles to it. Perhaps one take-home message later this morning is that child abuse, is that causing parental alienation in a child is a form of child psychological abuse. That's a really important message. I'm going to try to convince you of that in a systematic way. Maybe you already believe that, maybe you already think that, but I'm going to try to go through that later this morning. What I'm going to do in this first presentation is give you some basic definitions to make sure we're all on the same page, that we're all talking about the same thing when we say parental alienation. But I'm also going to go over some of the history of the concept. And I think, at least I hope that you'll find this interesting, because this idea has a really interesting history in that it doesn't just come down from one person or from one invention. That the themes in parental alienation they're a confluence of a number of different traditions in psychology and social work and psychiatry that came together about 30 years ago and created this concept called parental alienation. And the reason why I'm saying this in the very beginning, because sometimes alienation is criticized as being the invention of one person, and that person is Richard Gardner, who I'll tell more about later. But the whole concept is criticized because they say, oh, there was something wrong with Richard Gardner, and we should throw out the whole concept of parental alienation. And all that doesn't make any sense, because alienation, the concept that I'm going to explain, comes from a number of different scholarly sources. I myself, I think history is kind of interesting. And I think that this approach to telling you about alienation, I think you'll be able to tune into it if this concept is brand new to you. If you've never come to a talk on parental alienation before, I think that you'll understand what I'm driving at when I talk about these different sources. And secondly, if you already know something about parental alienation, I think you'll also appreciate what I'm trying to do here. So first of all, I need to just mention these disclosures. When I give a presentation, nowadays you're supposed to mention if there are any potential conflicts of interest, just in case you're interested. And what we want to do today, this is a little outline, and what we're going to start with is some basic definitions, and then I mention about the historical threads. We're going to go through that. Incidentally, the historical threads, they're kind of like one little nugget after another. So I don't want you to get it's not overly tedious, but if you do have a question about one of them, you should probably raise your hand while I'm on that particular nugget, because by the time we get to the end, we'll be past that particular point in time. So if you do have a question, come up or raise your hand, or Eric will tune you in. After the threads, we're going to talk about conclusions, and then I'm going to give you a kind of a more elaborate definition of parental alienation, because if you put these different threads together, you end up with a more comprehensive definition. So let's start with, just to make sure we're all on the same page, this is the definition that most of us use, and let's read through this together. A child, usually one whose parents are engaged in a high conflict separation or divorce, the child allies himself strongly with one parent, whom we call the preferred parent, and rejects a relationship with the other parent, whom we call the target parent, without legitimate justification. And so there are two big important features. Go back one slide. It's the first, that this almost always occurs in the context of a high conflict separation or divorce. And secondly, it's without legitimate justification. In other words, the whole idea of alienation is that the child is rejecting a parent even though that parent didn't do anything. In other words, we have a good functioning, a healthy, a nurturing parent who gets rejected, and so that's this whole idea is it doesn't make any sense because the child is rejecting a parent without a justification. If a child rejects a parent for a good reason, then that's a whole different something else. In fact, it has a different name. Usually that's called estrangement. So nowadays, these two words kind of are the definitions have pretty much been accepted. That alienation is rejecting a parent without a good reason. Estrangement is rejecting a parent when you have a good reason. So let me tell you about some of these threads. And I like to start in the 1940s. I mean, in the 1940s, obviously, people had never heard of parental alienation. But there were people back then who were doing research, and there's this interesting guy named David Levy, who was a child psychiatrist and a child psychoanalyst in New York City. And he and his colleagues did this big research project on a particular topic, overprotection, and specifically maternal overprotection. And what he did is he worked in one of these child welfare clinics in New York City, and they had all these files that they had accumulated for many, many years, and he had his staff go through them and identify examples of overprotection. Now, I'm not really sure why he was interested in this, but but that's a problem that sometimes happens in child rearing, is a parent gets enmeshed or over-involved with the children. And in all these cases, he describes many different angles to overprotection, and one of them sounds like what we're talking about today. One of the many examples that he comes up with sounds like parental alienation. He says, in some cases, the father is adjusted with little or ineffective protest to the mother-child monopoly. In other words, the mother and the child have a bond, and the dad is excluded. It added the derogatory attitude of the child toward the father, which was in several instances fostered by the mother. In other words, the mother is encouraging the kid to be to have problems with the dad, thereby reducing the paternal influence to its lowest degree. That's a really good description of parental alienation in 1943. And my point is, I'm going to say this point several times, is that the theme or the concept of alienation has arisen in a number of different studies and different contexts over many, many years. And I think it's here to stay, at least until we can figure out a way to do something about it really effectively. It's not something that was invented in the 1980s. So here's another example. Louise Despert was also a child psychiatrist, and she wrote a number of books. My hunch is you've never heard of her. I never heard of her before I got interested in this history. She wrote, she sort of discovered autism along with Leo Connor, the guy in Baltimore who gets all the credit for discovering child autism. But Dr. Despert also described a very similar thing, and there's a little bit of a controversy about who described it first. But in any case, she also, back in the 1950s, describes what we would call a parental alienation. It's a sharp temptation for the parent who remains with the child to break down their love for the one who has gone. This can be a temporary relief to the parent who does so, but it can only hurt the child. So anyway, she's another, I guess you would call these people precursors to the actual publication of the idea of alienation. So here's another one. Have you all ever heard of Murray Bowen? He was a family therapy person who actually grew up in Tennessee, and then he went different places, and he ended up in Washington, D.C. And by coincidence, when I worked in Washington, D.C., his office was right next door to my hospital, and so we actually went over and sat in on some of his seminars. But anyway, he had this idea that everything depends on family structure, and he was one of the people who introduced the family tree. I know a number of you are family therapists, and so I mean, is that right? Y'all have seen this kind of thing before. And So here's just an example of some of his coding that this illustrates. Let's see if we can figure this out. So this illustrates conflict between the mom and the dad. That the dad, see this big line here, the dad confides in the child, whose name is Lindsay. The mom focuses anger. So I guess you could say there's some alienation here between mom and Lindsay, and so on. So this is a triangle, right? Murray Bowen's idea was triangulation, and this is what he said. There is an intense interdependence between mother, father, and patient, which we have called the independent triad. Actually, if you read his book, most of what he says, he's talking about triads, but eventually he talks about triangulation. And then he says the most familiar pattern is what we would think of as parental alienation. The most familiar pattern is one in which the mother, in an extreme over-adequate position to the helpless patient, has the custody of the patient while the father is distant and passive. So that's another historical thread that I think is interesting. Okay, here's another one. The reason why I put this one in, by these people, this Westman and Klein, these are all psychiatrists who are still around. I've met some of these people. And the reason why I put this in is they talk in this article about something that sounds like parental alienation. But this article, as far as I can tell, was published in 1970. This is the first article in a peer-reviewed journal. This was published in the Archives of Psychiatry in 1970. And as far as I can tell, it's the first peer-reviewed article that describes parental alienation in this next slide. This is the same people. A pattern is found in which one parent and a child team up to provide an effect on the other parent. Not infrequently, a child sides with one parent or the other, though feeling ambivalent underneath. In these cases, one parent appears to deliberately undermine the other through the child. So anyway, incidentally, this guy, Jack Westman, the guy who was the senior author of that article, recently published a book. He has kind of a revolutionary idea. He has the idea that young people should be licensed. You should pass a test and get a license in order to have children. And he says it's obvious you have to have a license to drive a car, and don't you think it would make sense to have a license in order to have children? So I'm not sure how far he's going to get with that, but it's kind of a cool idea. So another family therapy person is Salvador Minuchin. So he was kind of in the same tradition as Murray Bowen, except they had slightly different ways of thinking about family and family interventions and so on. And incidentally, I should have mentioned, I started in 1943. I'm purposefully doing this chronologically. I don't know if that was obvious, but I wanted to do it chronologically so that you get a sense of how old it is and kind of how the concept percolates up over and over again in every decade since the 1940s. And then eventually we're going to get to this guy I mentioned, Richard Gardner, and he's important because he's the person who actually gave a name to this. All these other people are describing a phenomenon, and Gardner comes in 1985 and he gives it a name, which is parental alienation syndrome. So I should have said that in the beginning, that we're going through this chronologically. So Salvador Minuchin had another phrase. Murray Bowen said triangulation. Salvador Minuchin, his concept was cross-generational coalition. And this is just a quote from his book, The rigid utilization of one child and spouse conflicts take several forms. One of them is one of the parents joins the child in a rigidly bounded cross-generational coalition against the other parent. So there, he's describing, once again, what we would now think of as parental alienation. So let's look at one more. Now this is sort of useful. This is also in 1985. We're now up to the crucial year. A number of things happened in the 1980s, but several things actually happened in 1985. And Janet Johnston is a lady who's done a lot of research. She's a sociologist in California, and she's done a lot of research on children of divorce. And in one of her many projects, she described what we now call parental alienation in this article in 1985. Then we have another article in 1980. Oh, this is what she said. Okay. She had this, these people have different terms and different concepts. And so her concept was what she referred to as strong alliance, a strong, consistent, overt, verbal, and behavioral preference of one parent together with rejection and denigration of the other. That's our definition of parental alienation. Then the same year, we're still on, it was interesting, 1985, these two ladies, Elisa Benedict and Diane Shetke, and they're colleagues of mine, they're both child psychiatrists, and they both did forensic child psychiatry, and these two women are kind of considered the mothers of child forensic psychiatry. And they studied many, many different aspects of child forensic psychiatry, but this is one of the things they did, is they have another phrase that they used, the hostile vindictive parent, and they described it like this, that parent may pressure the child to take sides, causing him to feel guilty about visiting the other parent. In the extreme, this may lead to brainwashing. Very young children may be particularly susceptible to brainwashing, and they come to believe the horrible things that one parent says about the other. So these are all really good descriptions of what we now think of as parental alienation. I realize I'm kind of sort of beating a dead horse here, but the idea here is that because the next person is Dr. Gardner. You see, later in today, we're going to talk, this concept has come under fire more than almost any concept in psychology or psychiatry. I mean, there are other concepts that have been criticized or debated, like what? This thing called facilitated communication is something that people think they can get autistic children to communicate. Or there's recovered memories. Or the idea that autism is caused by something the mother ate during her pregnancy. Or, there are controversial concepts. And parental alienation is one of those controversial concepts. But I'm trying to get you to kind of see the big picture, because frequently the controversy comes to bear on this guy, Richard Gardner. And people, because he's the person who introduced the term parental alienation syndrome, and this is the article in which he did that. And so people have the idea, if they can diss Richard Gardner sufficiently, they can make parental alienation go away. So people criticize him for all sorts of reasons. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't really matter. Gardner was important because he did come up with the term, but there are all these other people who made the same observations. In other words, if you're trying to prove does it really happen or not, it's not just his research, it's all these other people. So up until now, I've been talking about things that happened prior to Gardner. This is when you're in college, sometimes you get an assignment like Sigmund Freud and the unconscious, and they ask you to write a term paper on the unconscious, the concept of the unconscious before Freud. That's interesting to do. Or Charles Darwin, and you can be asked, somebody might say, write a term paper on the concept of evolution before Darwin. Because I don't know if you remember, but there were people before Darwin who described evolution, including his uncle. His uncle's name was Erasmus Darwin, and he described the evolution of simple animals, simple creatures to more complicated creatures. But Darwin came along and actually described the mechanism by which it happens. That's why he made a name for himself. So anyway, I'm sort of doing something similar here, in that I've been writing a term paper here on parental alienation before Gardner, and that's brought us up to this point. So what he did is he actually came up with the name, parental alienation syndrome, and this is just a sentence from this paper that he wrote in 1985. PAS refers to a disturbance in which children are obsessed with deprecation and criticism of a parent, denigration that is unjustified and or exaggerated. So I think that's kind of the definition I gave you in the very beginning. So anyway, now we're going to talk about what happened after Gardner. Because it's the same thing, is that the idea of alienation is discussed in a number of different ways by different people. And my message simply is that there's a very broad theoretical and research basis for this idea. So who's the next one is Wallerstein and Blakesley. You all may remember this. They wrote this book about children of divorce called Second Chances. They were the people in Northern California, you know, that county north of San Francisco. What? Yeah, Marin County. And they collected 30 or 40 families and followed them for many, many years as to what happens during and after the divorce. So they also describe alienation. They introduced this really kind of esoteric term called the Medea syndrome. Modern Medeas do not want to kill their children, but they do want revenge on their former wives or husbands, and they exact it by destroying the relationship between the other parent and the child. So you all remember Medea, maybe. Let me tell you who that was. So this was in Greek mythology, and Medea was described sometimes as a priestess or as a sorceress, and she hooked up with Jason, and Jason had the task of locating the golden fleece, and because if he did, he was going to get a big reward, and he had several things he had to accomplish to do that, and Medea helped him in a ruthless way. Sometimes that involved killing somebody or poisoning somebody or doing something else. There are all sorts of stories about what Medea did. So she helped him, and so they got together. I guess they got, well, I don't know if he got married or whatever. Anyway, these are mythological figures. I don't know if they get married or not. But anyway, they got together and they had children. Well, they got back to their homeland, or whatever part of Greece they were from, and Jason left the relationship, and he went off and married a princess because he wanted to get ahead politically, I suppose. And Medea was enraged by this. Now, keep in mind, she kills people, she poisons people and everything. And that's how they had their success together. And she was enraged by what Jason did, and she killed 2 of her children. And anyway, Wallerstein and Blakesley resurrected that idea when they wrote this book. Yes, sir. I think we need to have you on the microphone.
Maybe I'll just ask you here, Kevin, in trouble. So far, your history is pretty gendered ordered, where the mothers are doing the bulk of the alienation, according to what we're reading, and the fathers are on the other end of it. My understanding is that thought has changed somewhat in this day, But I'm also wondering about the historical context of that, if you have some insight into why it was viewed that way for so long and why it's viewed somewhat differently now.
I think everybody heard that, which is a good question. As to between moms and dads, which one causes the alienation more frequently and which one is the victim of the alienation. And Mr. Chance is correct that in most examples that are given, the mother is more frequently the person who causes the alienation. And when Richard Gardner wrote that big article, that important article in 1985, I went back and analyzed that. He gives many little tiny vignettes in that article, like 3-sentence vignettes. And there are 24 little tiny examples in that article. And in 23 of them, the mother was the one causing the parental alienation. And he said that in most cases, in his experience, it was the mother. And then later, a few years later, he wrote and said, no, it's not always the mother. Sometimes it's the dad. And I think most of us who see these cases would agree that I've seen cases in both ways, that sometimes it's the mom who's the perpetrator, and sometimes it's the dad. And I think that maybe statistically more likely, I think mothers are more commonly the perpetrator of the alienation, but it does happen both ways. Well, why does it even happen that way? Well, the simplest explanation is that the alienating parent is more likely to be the custodial parent, and simply because the children live with him or her, and so it's easier to brainwash the children if you're the custodial parent. And so, I mean, that's one explanation for why moms are more likely to become an alienating parent. But it's really important to acknowledge that it happens in both directions. And I've had cases in both directions, of course.
I've got a question on that. I was actually sitting here having the same question in my mind, and I was framing it in terms of our society's now better understanding and awareness of domestic violence. Because when there is existing domestic violence in a family, which may not mean physical violence, it may mean emotional or sexual violence by the father against the mother, then how the children are handled in that situation, the domestic violence just plays out beyond that. I mean, it's implied that that's going to take effect when the mother tries to take control of her life and break off the abusive situation.
No, I think you're right. I think everybody heard that about the role of domestic violence in these situations. And it's correct, of course, that if a parent, like usually the mother, is a victim of domestic violence, she may well protect the children as a protective parent from the abusive other parent who is the dad. And that happens, and that's not alienation. In other words, to remove the child from an abusive parent is not alienation. That's what we would have called estrangement, when the children resist going to see that parent because of actual abuse. Now, it is interesting, and some people have done research on this, that sometimes, let's keep it where the mom is the victim and the dad is the perpetrator of domestic violence. So just for the sake of this illustration. So sometimes the domestic violence dad who terrorizes the mom and terrorizes the children is the perpetrator of the parental alienation. In other words, as part of his campaign to hurt the mom and terrorize the mom, he convinces the children to get on his side and to ally against the mom. And sometimes it's really painful to see this. I mean, some little boy will see his dad beat up on the mom, and then the little boy will go beat up on the mom a little bit. I mean, it's pretty sad and ugly to see that happen. But there is a lot of interaction between domestic violence issues and parental alienation issues. And I'll just give you my bottom line, which is both of them are really important. They both need to be studied. Perhaps there needs to be more communication between the DV people and the PA people. I think it's good to have the questions, by the way. It sort of creates the little dialogue, and it sort of interrupts some of the flow, which is fine. Let me tell you what happened after. This was also in the 1980s. So these are two books. It's the first edition and the second edition of a book called Children Held Hostage. And the next slide tells you who wrote the book. These two people, Clower and Rivlin. Stanley Clower is a sociologist, and his wife, Bryn Rivlin, is a social worker. And all these people are still around. They're practicing in Philadelphia. And they do custody evaluations, which I know some of you all do custody evaluations, or at least you see families in custody situations. And over the years, they saved all their data from all their cases. And in their first book, they only had about 600 cases, but in their second book, they had 1,000 cases, 1,000 families. And they liked the term brainwashing and programming. The definitions are up here. The definitions of one or the other are slightly different. My understanding is that programming is sort of the overall theme of what the parent is trying to do. The program in the parent's mind is, I want my child to myself, and I'm going to exclude the other parent from our family. That's programming. And brainwashing are the specific steps that they take. And these people listed a whole series of different methods for brainwashing a child to dislike and fear the other parent. So I mention these books because this is the first really detailed description of how to do it. And it's intended for therapists to read so they get a sense of what their families might be doing, the people who come to their office. The other thing that's interesting about these books, the Clower and Rivlin books, is that they were published by the American Bar Association. The ABA, I think the family law segment of the ABA, commissioned Clower and Rivlin to do this research, and the research took years to do, and both books. And that's really significant because it really means that there are people in the American Bar Association who recognize this issue and are concerned about it. And obviously it ends up in court frequently and so on. The ABA in the first page of the book says, just because something is published by the ABA does not mean that we endorse it, which I guess is a fair statement to make. But it is important that they thought this was an important problem. This next book is called The Custody Evaluation Handbook. So this is also work that was done in the 1980s, but this particular book was actually published in 1995. And the person who wrote this is this man called Barry Bricklin, who is a psychologist in Philadelphia. He also did many, many custody evaluations. And he came up with certain definitions in the 1980s. And eventually, when he writes the book, he realizes that his definitions are consistent with what Gardner wrote about parental alienation. And he likes to have these abbreviations, and one of his favorite is NBOIA, which stands for not based on actual interaction. And what that means is that a child who experiences NBOIA has feelings about one of the parents which is based on brainwashing and not on actual interaction with that parent. Now, Another reason why Brooklyn is important is because he devised tests to measure the child's perception of the mom and the dad. And they're called, one of them is called the Brooklyn Perceptual Test, and the other one is called the PORT, which is the, I forget what PORT. Anyway, the one we're going to talk about is the Brooklyn Perceptual Test. And people use this in custody evaluations to size up the child's perception of the mom and the dad. In fact, have you all ever heard of Brooklyn, or does anybody ever use his test? It's important because some people say that parental alienation is untestable, that it's impossible objectively to measure the child's relationship to the mom and the dad, that everything is simply impressionistic by the evaluator, and so it's not valuable data. Let me just tell you about this one test. So this goes back to the 1980s, and he's published this over and over again, and you can buy it from his publishing company and so on. But this is on the BPS. The evaluator sits in front of the child who's on the other side of the table. On the table are these cards that I'm going to show you in a second. And there's a series of questions about mom and a series of questions about dad, the same questions, but it's done in a clever way that the mom question and the dad question are not back to back. In other words, a given topic is addressed by the child about the mom, and then 15 or 20 minutes later about the dad. That's just to make it independent. So this is an example of a question. If you had a pet, how well would dad do at taking care of it if you had to go away for a few days? That's what I would ask the child verbally. And then the child gives me an answer, and I write down his verbal response. And usually kids are very succinct. They say, oh, it'd be fine. Or they might say, not so good. So anyway, this is what happens next. That there's this card, and I put this card in front of the child, and I say, well, see this card. This end is dad not so well taking care of your pet, and this is dad very well taking care of your pet. And the child has a pointy thing. The child has a stylus, and this card is on a little styrofoam thing. And so the child is asked to poke a hole, and here it comes. In this case, the child pokes a hole right there. And it was an interesting idea, that Brooklyn's idea is that this poking the hole is, first of all, it's a nonverbal communication. And his idea was that nonverbal communications might be more accurate, directly connect to your unconscious than verbal communications. And secondly, you can measure it, because you look on the other side of the card and you can see that this child scored a certain number for this particular question. So I think there are 40 questions about mom and 40 about dad or so on, and you can add them up. So he's discovered, and most kids, well, how do kids respond to this? Most kids say, oh, mom is good at some things, dad is good at some things, and so on. And you add up all the numbers, and the mom and dad are roughly equal. Most children in intact families, and most children in divorced families. They might say one parent is maybe somewhat better in some areas, and the other parent maybe not quite so good. But what Brooklyn discovered when he did hundreds of children, he discovered that some children score one parent over and over and over again at this end, which I think is not doing well, and the other parent over and over and over again at this end, which is a higher number, you can see this, which is doing very well. And so and then he had another abbreviation for this, which was MMU, which stands for mind made up. So the MMU child automatically, in fact, I've done this on a number of children, and they do this. Once they understand how the test works, they automatically, oh, this is about dad, he goes there. This question's about mom, she goes here. That the child automatically, without even thinking, gives one parent totally negative reviews. So anyway, it's an interesting way to measure what happens in alienation, which is called splitting, where the child perceives one parent totally one direction, the other parent totally the other direction. So anyway, I guess the idea here is that as time has gone on, there's been attempts to create more science and objective testing for this concept. Well, this next lady is a really interesting lady. Leona Kopetsky was a social worker who ran a clinic in Denver. And for years, she and her colleagues, whom she supervised, did custody evaluations that were court-ordered by the court, whatever the family court was in Denver. And over the years, they did hundreds of these. And as time went on, she thought she should write this up. I mean, they had this vast experience of doing these evaluations, and they started to look at themes that might happen over and over again. And one of the themes that she and her friends identified was what we would call alienation. Now, at the time when she was doing all this in the 1980s, she had never heard of Richard Gardner, and the concept, she had never heard the words parental alienation. But when she eventually got around to writing this up, which was in 1998, she was aware, and so she put all her data in the framework of parental alienation. So I don't know, what's my point? My point is that this idea has been discovered and rediscovered in different clinics and in different research projects and just by everyday practitioners over and over again. So I kind of forget what she said. Let's see what she said. The alienating parent may or may not be consciously aware of manipulating the child, and so on. Alienating parents often believe that the accusations they make are true, but have developed those beliefs by faulty reasoning process. So she's commenting here on how opinionated sometimes the preferred parent or the alienating parent is. In really severe cases, this becomes delusional. In other words, the mother or the dad have delusions that the other parent is an evil person. And so they transfer those delusions to the child, who then believes the other parent is an evil or dangerous person. But she was another person who, more or less on her, well, she wasn't all by herself. She had a whole team of people who helped her do these evaluations, but who described this. Now, this next person is a famous guy who is, I'm going to say a couple of words here about Richard Warshak. Dr. Warshak is a psychologist in Texas, and he got involved in this way back. I think he was a friend of Gardner's, and they worked together on some cases. And he is a very prolific writer. Can I ask you about Warshak? Has anybody ever read any of these books called Divorce Poison? Thank you. So the first one was the first edition, and the other one is the second edition. And then this, I think, is from Slovakia, this is Slovenia, this is Finland, this is Korea, and this is Japan, I think. So he's the most widely read author on this topic. And in fact, if you were to ask Dr. Warshak, he would tell you that, in fact, it's true. He would tell you that these books on Amazon are the most widely purchased books regarding alienation. And so I think he's a really good example of how, on a professional level, he has spread the word about this problem. These books are very colorful. And what I think they constitute what I would call qualitative research. In other words, qualitative research is things that are descriptive. like a narrative research report or a case study or something like that. Quantitative research is research that's measurable, like testing that's measurable. And there's both types. In the field of parental alienation, there's both types. He's a really good example of qualitative research because these books that he published contain hundreds of little anecdotes. In other words, hundreds of descriptions of cases, which I think they're based on his own experience, but they're sort of twisted around a little bit, or obviously they don't use the original names or anything, or places or whatever. So it's a really good example of extensive qualitative descriptive research on parental alienation. And this is one of the things that he says. I wanted to dig up something that he actually said. This book explains why the common approaches are impotent, why doing nothing will accomplish nothing, and while relying primarily on reasoning is an unreasonable approach to the problem. So Warshak has gotten into interventions. What should you do about parental alienation? And he's discussed this in many different ways, in many different articles. And he's mentioning a couple of choices. Some people say that if you have a case of alienation, you shouldn't try to treat it at all, because if you treat it, it's not going to work, and it's just going to cause everybody more headaches. So he does not agree with that. There are other people who say, relying on reasoning, he's referring to kind of traditional talking therapy, where you sit down with a client and you say, tell me about what's going on and let me help you understand the situation better. In other words, I'm going to help you reason things better. So that might be helpful in mild cases. There's a lot of mild cases of alienation where it's caught early, like in this whole idea of taking high conflict families and educating them in the beginning before they get too far advanced down going to court. That works. That kind of intervention works. Once the child becomes severely alienated, that doesn't work, and that's what he's referring to here. That once the child is severely alienated, you have to think about other things. So anyway, he's a good example of educating both the public and mental health and legal professionals. So let's move on to the next one. We're making progress here, and I realize this is an overview, but I hope you're kind of getting the idea that these are really important authors, and you can go back, obviously on your handout, you can go back and look up some of these things if you want to read the whole article. So this is a really famous article. I'm going to ask you about this too. This is 2001 by Kelly and Johnston, which is called a reformulation of the syndrome. Kelly and Johnston, is that something that are you all familiar with this?
We're missing that slide, I think, in our handout.
Can anybody find it on the handout? Page 7, she says, somebody said. Okay, thank you. So, this is the same Dr. Johnston that I mentioned earlier, who's done a lot of research, and her colleague, Joan Kelly. And so they thought that the traditional definitions by Gardner could be improved. And so they wrote this kind of famous paper called The Reformulation. And they describe almost the exact same thing, but they use different terminology. And in particular, they introduce a whole new term called the alienated child, because they felt the focus should be on the child, not on the mom and the dad. But in any case, here's their definition. An alienated child expresses freely and persistently unreasonable negative feelings and beliefs, blah, 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 toward a parent that are significantly disproportionate to the child's actual experience with that parent. So that's the same definition that you've heard now about 3 or 4 times. What they're talking about is the same thing, except the focus is slightly different. And I should say, though, that even though people refer to this a lot, this terminology has never gotten off the ground. In other words, if you try to find a published paper on the alienated child, I don't think you're going to find very many. But if you try to Google or use, Web of Science or something to find papers on parental alienation, those are still published. Well, that was 2001. I now want to advance to 2007. And I'm sure, if you read New Yorker magazine, we have this guy here who's kind of scratched up in a bar, and he's talking to this guy, and he's saying, "Since we don't have any children, my ex turned the cats against me." So this illustrates something. I mean, it illustrates that the concept of parental alienation permeated the general culture. In other words, the only way that you would understand this joke is if, at least on some level, you're aware that sometimes this actually happens when people split up. So this next thing is the DSM-5. So this comes up over and over again as to whether or not parental alienation is going to be an official diagnosis. And I can tell you already that it's not, the actual words parental alienation are not an official diagnosis, although I would argue that the concept is in the DSM-5. So I got involved with this about 10 years ago when DSM-5 was being created, and I asked them whether anybody had proposed parental alienation. And they told me no, but please do that. So, I was invited to send in a proposal, which I wrote up, and I did. And then they said that's not long enough, so do another one. And I did a longer one. And then I ended up writing this whole book, which my friends and I wrote this whole book called Parental Alienation, DSM-5, and ICD-11. So it argued extensively the different reasons why parental alienation should be in the book. And we got halfway there. I felt that we were halfway successful because we knew we were having an influence on the people writing the book. And they ended up using our material, but they didn't want to use those words. So they ended up saying the following: this new diagnosis, this is an actual diagnosis, and so it's a V code, so it's not a mental disorder, but in DSM terminology, it's a mental condition. A mental condition are the things that are in there's a chapter, I think it's called Other Conditions That May Be of Clinical Interest, something like that. And so it's called Child Affected by Parental Relationship Distress. You can actually write that down as a diagnosis if you're doing an evaluation of somebody. And the definition consists of one sentence. CAPRD should be used when the focus of clinical attention is the negative effects of parental relationship discord, like high conflict, on a child in the family, including effects on the child's mental or other medical disorders. So in other words, if there's this is a saying, if there's conflict between the parents and the child is affected, you can use this diagnosis. And this includes parental alienation. But it also includes other things. This includes domestic violence, that if there's domestic violence between the parents and the children are affected, this term can be used for the children. And this is not used for the parents, this is used for the child. That helps to identify children who have been affected by high conflict between their parents. And my friends and I wrote an article about this, and the article is called Child Affected by Parental Relationship Distress. So I brought a few of them, and I think they probably have been all picked up. Do you want to, somebody want to, it's the orange one that's right there, is this article. And yeah, if you don't have one, since I know there weren't enough, they're going to be distributed. I think Eric is going to distribute to everybody a reprint of this article. So the next person I want to mention is Craig Childress. Let me add, and he wrote this famous book called Foundations. And I want to explain a little bit about Dr. Childress. So he also is well known. And let me poll the audience one more time. Have any of you read any of his material or know about Craig Childress? Yeah. So he has a different term that he likes. This is him in his book. And then this is the name of the book, An Attachment-Based Model of Parental Alienation. So he has this new term called the attachment-based PA, and this is actually his quote. It refers to the child's triangulation into the spousal conflicts through the formation of a cross-generational coalition with a narcissistic or borderline parent. Now, Dr. Childress' whole idea is that he thinks that the traditional concept of parental alienation should be discarded and that this new concept should be introduced instead. And his emphasis is on where the PA comes from. In other words, his idea is that the alienating parent has a personality disorder, and suppose it's the mother, and that's created through things that happened to her as a child. In other words, he wants to go back in time and find out what is the underlying process that leads to the alienation. And his theory is that there's trauma for the mother, attachment trauma, and that causes, as she grows up, she develops a personality disorder, either narcissistic or borderline or both. And that then she, as she has children, she re-experiences that trauma in her spouse. There's kind of a number of steps here. And then she convinces that she conveys that to the children, or through projection. You know, projection is when you have a feeling and you project it onto somebody else. So she projects her feelings of trauma onto the child, so the child thinks he's been traumatized by the other parent, by the dad. So it's a complicated series of steps. And in fact, I think that makes sense in some cases. Let me explain something about these different terms. So the first term that he uses is the child's triangulation. And we already covered that this morning, right? That comes from Murray Bowen. And the second term is formation of cross-generational coalition. And that comes from this other fellow, Salvador Minuchin. And this thing about borderline comes from another person named Otto Kernberg. So I want to point out that Childress is not plagiarizing from these people. I mean, he's quoting from these people. In other words, he wants to say that his formulation is based on much other research that many people have done, which all makes sense. In other words, I think most people would agree that there are some cases of severe parental alienation that can be explained in the way that he talks about. There is a fuss going on and between him and many other people, not because of that, but because he says this is the only explanation. It's kind of an interesting point of view, is that he talks about this a lot, and then he gives talks and presentations, and he says that his way of describing alienation is the only correct way to do it, and everybody else should back down and just do it his way. So, in fact, I think I have one more term. I've been doing this chronologically, so we're now up to 2016. And on the next slide, it explains what this is about. So this is another term called the resist-refuse dynamic, and it's just another way of saying that there are times when children don't want to go see the other parent. But this is a broader concept, and this covers all the different reasons. In other words, alienation is not the only reason why a child doesn't want to go see the other parent. There may be, the other parent may have been abusive, the other parent may have been unfaithful to the mother, There are other reasons that might come up. And so the resist-refuse notion is that when you evaluate a family, sometimes you don't know what's really happening underneath, but you do know the child is resisting or refusing contact. And so these people, Walters and Friedlander, have developed an intervention to cover all those different possibilities. So that's kind of brand new this year or so ago. So what have we learned from all this? I've been trying to get some things across. What are our conclusions based on all this? So the first idea, and I mentioned this before, is that sometimes the concept of alienation is criticized simply by criticizing Richard Gardner. I won't go through it into all, but they blame him for this or that. And I think it's really important to understand that we would have parental alienation even if he never came along. We would still have the concept, and that it's important to understand that there are many different sources for the theoretical foundation of this issue. There are others I didn't even get to, like the whole thing of children developing false beliefs. You know, sometimes children think they've been abused and they really weren't, because somehow they've come up with that idea. And so children sometimes develop false beliefs. And so that fits in to this concept. The other thing I think I've been trying to get across is that when people talk about this, most of the researchers and the practitioners are saying almost the same thing. There might be little nuances of different, but most people are saying the same thing. However, there are skeptics. There are people who don't like this concept. And I list here who I call soft skeptics, and I mentioned both of them. They're like Janet Johnston and Craig Childers. And I call them soft skeptics because they don't like to use the term. They kind of believe in the concept, but they both disagree with the term parental alienation. And so sometimes that gets complicated, people get into arguments about that. But we're all on the same page, roughly. Then there are hard skeptics. Hard skeptics are people who say there is no such thing, that this doesn't even exist. And they say that Richard Gardner in 1985 fabricated this. And they even use the word hoax, that Gardner created this as a hoax because he was an expert witness for fathers and he wanted their fathers to get the children away from the mothers. So there are extreme critics or skeptics, and these are some examples. Incidentally, my talk this afternoon is specifically on this issue of how to deal with the controversy and how to deal with people who totally kind of get rid of this concept. But there are some people who, I don't know, you may have heard of some of them. Joanna Silberg is a psychologist in Baltimore. Robert Geffner is an attorney who travels around a lot. Joan Mayer is an attorney in Washington, D.C. I think Richard DeCote is nearby. Is he's somewhere in Louisiana? Covington. And Kathleen Russell, I think, is a woman in California. Anyway, don't get scared off by these people. The vast majority of people agree with this. Now, let me, how do I know that? Because we took a poll. And one of the many things that have happened, a few years ago, there was a poll of people who attended this organization called AFCC. This is another organization that people might find helpful, the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. It's mental health and legal people. And at the end of one of the presentations, they took a poll of everybody in the room, which is several hundred people, and they asked them, do you think that some children are manipulated by one parent to reject the other? And 98% said yes. In other words, my idea here is that the vast majority of people are on the same page. There are a small number. In fact, Joan Mayer, the person who I described as a hard skeptic, was in the audience. And she, no doubt, was in that 2% who said that this doesn't happen. let me go back then and just rehash the basic definition. Which, this is what I already read, right? So we don't need to go through this again. But here's a schematic picture of it. And so we had the preferred parent and the alienated parent, and they fuss at each other, they blame each other for what's going on. And then right here is the parental alienation is what the child does. In other words, it's the child's symptoms in himself, but also in his relationship to this parent, the target parent. And then this big red line is the causing of the alienation. And I'm making a little transition here to my next topic, that we believe that the alienating parent who causes this in the child is committing psychological abuse. That the parent is causing the child to lose a relationship with the other parent. That's bad to do that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about later this morning. Kind of the current definition is what we would call the 4-factor model. This is in your handouts. I'm not going to study this too hard. But the 4-factor model is that, first of all, you have to be able to show that the rejected parent in the past had a positive relationship with the child, which is no longer present. That secondly, there's no abuse or neglect. In other words, we've already explained that 2 or 3 times, that if there is an abusive parent, and the child rejects that person, then that's not alienation, that's estrangement. That you have to be able to show that the preferred parent has in fact conducted alienating behaviors, and there's a list of these. And finally, you have to be able to show that the child himself manifests some typical symptoms. And people have done research on this. Maybe the one who's done the most is a woman named Amy Baker, who's in New York City. And these are this is her list of the common alienating behaviors that a parent might do to turn the child against the other parent. For instance, bad-mouthing the other parent, confiding in the child about legal issues, and so on. There's a list. There are 17 of these. These are the big 10, forcing the child to reject the target parent. So these are what we would call alienating behaviors which are in the alienating parent. And then separate from that are the symptoms of PA, which are in the child. And this is the standard list, which is in your handout. This list was created by Richard Gardner, going back. It was his list in that article that he wrote in 1985. But we're still using it. It may need to be cleaned up. It may need to be refined by further research. Let me see if there's another. Is that? Yeah, I just want to point out here that these alienating behaviors and the other have been addressed through research. In other words, we're not just taking Gardner's word for this, or those other books, but Baker and other people have actually conducted different kinds of research, usually retrospective research, in which they come up with this material. So this is one of her articles, and the next thing I think is another article. It looks almost the same, but it's actually a different article. This is the 8 symptoms. The other are the alienating behaviors. Yeah. So we've gone down a long road here, and I realize that we've touched on a lot of things and gave very brief accounts of a number of different things. But I hope you get the big picture. The big picture is that alienation is really serious. Children lose a parent as a result of it. It's been studied a good deal. What's interesting about it, it's so obvious. It's so obvious that it has been rediscovered so many different times by different people, almost independently. And so that, I just think that is sort of interesting. It's sort of like in the field of medicine, somebody discovering epilepsy, and then 10 years later, somebody else discovers epilepsy, and so on. I think it's kind of similar in that it's been discovered by so many different people. I think we have time for one or two questions if there's anything that might come up before we break for the break. Okay, well, here we are.
What is the independent thinking with the child?
Can you say it louder, please?
Yeah, I'll say what. So she was asking me, one of the things on the list of 8 things, is a term called the independent thinker phenomenon. And that was a term introduced by Gardner in 1985. And it's really interesting. What it means is the child pretends to come up with these ideas by herself, but it's really pretty obvious that she's been indoctrinated by somebody. But it's manifested spontaneously, and it's put into quotes. Usually independent thinker is in quotes because the child really isn't an independent thinker. But it's usually manifested spontaneously by the child when the child comes in for an evaluation meeting. You know, the child will be saying, oh, Dad did this, he did this. Oh, by the way, I never want to see him again, and that's my opinion. Nobody has told me to say that. And the child kind of figures this out on her own frequently, that she realizes that there are these different opinions floating around, and that she doesn't want to acknowledge that maybe her mother suggested these things, or whoever. And so the child spontaneously says, these are my own ideas that I came up on my own. So it was something that Gardner observed. You know, he did lots of custody evaluations, and he observed that in some of them. I think we need to finish up. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see you in a little while.